Welcome to the BEZA Performance live stream. My name is Marshall Henley, the president of BEZA Performance, and I'm going to welcome my friend and colleague, Doug Dedman from DBM Systems today, S&OP Thursday, yet again. Welcome, Doug.
Wow, good to be here, Marshall.
So today we're going to be talking a bit about risks and assumptions in the S&OP process and just how to kind of think about those from both of what are they, but also how do they work their way into the process. But before we do that, we always like to level set with a bit of a definition, kind of our anchoring definition of what S&OP is. Let me pull that up. We believe S&OP is the president's handle on the business, and that would mean that there's a clear link between strategy and execution. The president is actually participating in decisions about the flow rate for the business by family. There's very clear accountabilities using the RACI model that the president actively managing, as well as a regular and repeatable management process for those accountabilities. And finally, the S&OP process should actually help you make measurable and actionable improvements, both for the business and for the S&OP process itself. So S&OP gets better the more you do S&OP. So hopefully I did that some justice, Doug. I'll let you do the hard part. You get to talk about risks and assumptions. So tee it up for us. What is it?
It's a great topic because we've just spent the last 3 or 4 sessions really talking on the demand planning side and focused on the development of the demand plan, right? So we talked through the accountabilities. We talked about the constraining and the unconstrained demand plan. And really, this is a good topic to kind of segue beyond the demand plan side of things, because the risks and assumptions apply to the demand planning side, but they also apply to what you want to be documenting as part of the supply side of the S&OP process.
Sure.
And so I think it's a good segue into that side of things, and maybe a bit of a discussion as to why do I feel that the risks and assumptions are an important part of the S&OP process. And so I thought I just put a few points down on here as something for us to kind of tee this topic up a little bit as to why, when we think about the executive S&OP process, risks and assumptions are important. And really the first one that I would pick on for this is because forecasts by definition are inaccurate. And if you recall, when we talked about demand planning, we said demand planning is a broader subject than just forecasting, but the forecast is part of the demand plan. And so because they're inaccurate, it's our best, and I'm air quoting this for you. So it's our best guess of what's the plan, what went into the plan, and really the forecast or the risk and assumption is really how did you come up with the plan, and
right.
that's an important piece of this. The second part about the risks and assumption, why it's important, is that it's a monthly process, right? So S&OP is a monthly process. And I don't know about you, Marshall, but I sometimes have a hard time remembering what I did last week, let alone
Yesterday.
what I did last month, right? So,
Sure.
part of the reason I think it's really important to have a formal process around risks and assumptions is that it's the documentation of what was decided or how the plan was come up with last month. And you're documenting that. So when you come to it the next month, you actually know what went into your thought process. And so it's not like, oh, I know we talked about that last month, but what did we decide?
Right.
And so this is really that documentation on that side. The other part of this, and we've talked about this as well in the past, but it comes back to why a formalized risk and assumption process is important, is because we always want to be measuring our performance to the plan, right? We talked about that in terms of bookings. We said, hey, what is your bookings call? What is the plan that you're having for the month? What actually happened in bookings in terms of the numbers? Same thing from a shipment standpoint, and then same thing from a supply standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But measuring that performance to the plan in those numbers actually only tells part of the story, right? Like we really want to understand, is the reason we miss something, is it because things changed drastically from last month? Or did we make some bad assumptions in the plan? And if we made bad assumptions in the plan, essentially we want to, look at that whole process and learn out of that, how are we actually putting the plan together, right?
And
Uh,
just to remind folks, a miss would mean you're out of tolerance. It doesn't mean you number exactly. I mean, most people know
right.
that, but it's good to understand it.
No,
We're
thanks for bringing
focusing
that
on
up,
that.
Mark.
So yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because it's right. A miss being you're out of tolerance, and that really should drive a root cause analysis for you to
Yes.
figure out why. But I think at the very start, it's always a good point to say, well, hey, did conditions change that we didn't expect, or did we just really have a bad set of assumptions?
Yeah.
And then the other one on here is accountability. And so we talk about this a lot, and you kicked off in the things that you mentioned at the top of this, this idea that it's an executive discipline that drives accountability in the organization. But in terms of being able to hold people accountable to something, the numbers are one part of that. But the
Yeah.
thinking behind the numbers, and this is something the executives, that I've worked with, will talk about quite a bit, is, hey, how did you come up with that number? What is the thing, and having a way to really hold the team accountable specifically to the not just the numbers, but how they came up with the numbers.
Right.
So hopefully that gives a little bit of kind of a framework as to why this concept of risks and assumptions are pretty important for S&OP. Yeah,
And
go
it,
ahead,
and
Marshall.
we always like to point out when we talk about accountability in this model, and I think any healthy model would have the same sort of view. It's how do we avoid those mistakes if if there were mistakes, and or if there was risk and assessment analysis was wrong, how do we avoid being wrong in the future? Or if we can't, acknowledging that when we have those kinds of scenarios, that we have a more risky situation in terms of the call we're making. So the accountability here actually just folds right back into the improvement that was kind of the last thing that we in terms of what executive S&OP ought to be doing.
Right, and we'll use the term, S&OP works well if you have a learning organization, right?
Yeah.
Because there's nothing more frustrating than you do some work with an organization around the S&OP process, and you come back in 6 months or 8 months, and it looks exactly like the way it was left.
Yeah.
Because
Same errors.
I'd like to think we're pretty good at what we do and helping companies get S&OP going, but we
Yeah.
don't have all the answers. And part of that is, you have to make it your own, right?
Absolutely.
And so part of that means that you've got to be learning as you go through it. So yeah, I think that's pretty important. I think the other thing, and you talk about risks and you talk about assumptions, and I do see a slightly different definition between the two things.
Sure.
And often, especially in the last few years, everybody's been talking a lot about the risks, right? So this idea that we've got risks in our supply chain, and so we're going, oh, what's going to happen when they shut the border down? What's going to happen when and that was a big one for us up here in Canada, right? Shut the border
Yeah.
down. What's the impact? Stuff coming in as it slows the supply chain down. Just in an S&OP meeting this morning, right? Just talking about, wow, with this next wave that comes on, how's that going to impact? What's the risk that we need to kind of account for? And so when I look at it and think about risks, and maybe if you pull up the screen, you can leave us on in the bottom corner there, Marshall. But it's really kind of the idea of significant concerns or challenges that could impact the plan. And often you'll want to do an upside or downside plan with that. And that was a little bit of what we're going through today was, okay,
Mhm.
well, if we on the downside plan, where do we think that's going to be? Somewhere in there, you've got to come up with what is the plan you really want the business to go to. And so the assumption is really, what am I going to do about the risk? Right? So risk identifies that it's there, but the
Yeah.
assumption is essentially, what did we say to get the plan that we're presenting on the table? And that's really, whether that's the underlying data, the analysis, the research, I hate to use gut feel, but I'll put that in there, that really goes into actually creating the plan, right? And so if I look at it, it's kind of like saying, hey, much like we said in demand planning, the forecast is an input to the demand plan. The risks are an input into the assumptions. A lot of places, you will go through a lot of work on identifying the risks, but then you don't necessarily identify, when we put the plan together, what were the assumptions that we made about that risk? What did we think was going to happen? And the key word in S&OP, and we talk about this besides the sales and operation side, the other key word in
Yeah.
this is everything that you put out there is a plan, right?
Right.
It's a plan of what we want to have happen or what we think is going to happen. And that plan requires that you're doing some sort of assumption in there. And so,
Yeah.
really, what I'm advocating is not only identify the risks, but identify the assumptions that you use to put the plan together. Because then I
Yeah.
now have a plan that's got some accountability on that side.
Yeah. And that's a good point. Accountability goes with actionability, right? We're working towards things that are doable. We don't like the term. I mean, we use forecasts, but we don't do a demand forecast. Forecast might go into a demand plan, and we say that it's a demand plan because a plan has stuff you can do mid-month, right? If you're having, if
Right.
sale A isn't going to come in, maybe you can go find sale B and pull it forward so that you end up hitting plan. In terms of the volume metrics for the S&OP plan, that is. And I think that's a really good point to make regarding risks and assumptions. It's part of the mentality of making things both actionable and accountable.
Right, right. It's and we always say, the numbers need to support the story, right, of what's going on, but the numbers are only part of the story,
Right.
right? And so the things have to go together. And yeah, we just went through a pretty significant pre-exec meeting this morning where there's a fair amount of uncertainty in their marketplace. And well, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? Well, at some point in time, you have to make the decision, because you are actually locking things in,
Yep.
whether or not you want to admit it, especially on the supply chain side of things, the lead times that you need to look at, as you look out further, your commitment to those and the assumption that you make in those, it's definitely something
Yeah.
you've got to be thinking about, because and documenting, because that is the underlying piece that says, yeah, what's our best chance of actually hitting this plan?
I mean, that's a good way to describe why we call this the president's handle on the business. It's that actionability behind S&OP, meaning you're not just trying to see what if, all the what if possibilities. You're picking one. You're actually saying, well, of all the likely scenarios that we think we can affect, this is the one we're going to go after. And the assumption that goes into that is, whatever it is, right? It's the components of that particular pick out of all the what ifs. And sometimes when you have the wrong people in charge of the S&OP process, not knocking would be in charge, but people who, really are more analytical in terms of their job description, right? They're supposed to generate the what ifs. They may not be the best person to pick the right one to go after, and that's where the decision making about what is going to flow through that family, what is the flow rate going to be. And if you're risk averse, then you're risk averse. Put that in the assumptions along with the reduced list of risks that you think you have to the plan.
Right. And quite frankly on this, and it's the same thing we talk about in the plan, where we say, hey, you've got to come out of the meeting with a plan, one that everybody agrees to.
Right.
You really want to have the same underlying set of assumptions in this, right? And yeah, if you're allowed to call, your comment on yeah, like I'm going to have four different plans. Well, yeah, but somewhere in those four plans, you got to execute one of them, right?
One plan, yeah. Only one can be
There's-
done, so you've got to pick
yeah,
it. And
it's like my golf game. If I'm allowed to call the shot I wanted to make after I made the shot, I'm do. You know, but if I have to call it before and what the plan I wanted, yeah, that that could be a challenge. So yeah,
I
so
just had a little
maybe
bit
to
of an
really,
audio just in case. I think what you're saying is if I can pick my shot after the shot I wanted to make after I actually make my real shot, then
yep,
I'm going to change what I would have picked. So
yep, yep. Don't
yeah,
know. Yeah, sorry if
yeah,
my audio
I
is
meant
breaking
to
up there.
I meant to double bogey that hole. That was my whole goal.
I'm I'm playing the Marshall. I'm playing the long game, right? Like
Yeah,
this is
wearing them out.
yeah. So, but yeah, that's I mean that is the challenge in this, and yeah, you really I don't have a problem with an upside or downside plan. Don't get me
Yeah,
wrong on that, but I would say that sometimes we focus too much on this upside downside
yeah,
plan, and we're not necessarily thinking about what is our what is our actual flexibility, and that's where we talk about buffer targets and all of those
yeah,
sort of things that really go into that side of it. Too often the knee-jerk reaction to something is, well,
mm,
create me a downside plan and create me an upside plan. Really what you've got to you've really got a plan that you've got to commit to, because a
yeah.
portion of that plan is going to be in a frozen or inelastic zone. So that's part of it. So
Yeah, and I don't know if you're going to get to it in your presentation, but you know, the vast majority of people we work with in manufacturing have supply chain lead times and other factors in the business that just will not allow them to make major changes to their S&OP plan or their supply as part of the S&OP process mid-month. And if they did that, it should be escalated maybe all the way to the president, right?
yeah,
And that's why we do recommend frozen and semi-frozen zones. And some of them are days and some of them are weeks long. But the point being, uh, if you're trying to hedge the plan bet by making changes mid-month, usually that's a bad thing,
yeah,
not generally a good thing. You may have a different business you're operating in where that's completely possible. But for most of the clients that we've had where that's like on the table, some sort of mid-month alteration of the S&OP plan, or they just ignore the S&OP plan on the supply side and make whatever seems like it's coming through the pipeline. Usually there's some real downside to that. Like commit
yep,
to the plan, document your risks, and then review it the next month and say, well, we made too much stuff. We've got some extra excess inventory. What are we going to do with
yep,
the new plan? And kind of move forward from there. So again,
yep,
that very generalized description, but that's the idea of I think what we're getting into here, right? Just you got a monthly process, document your risks and assumptions, and then go boldly execute the plan you picked. Go do
right.
it.
Right, exactly. So maybe what I can do is I have kind of a series of things that I would call kind of risk and assumptions best practice. And this is
Okay.
not an exhaustive list, but I'll go through some of these, and then I'll actually give some examples of this through just so you can kind of see this. So this is you can call this Doug's best practice
Right.
listing of risk and assumptions if you want a really long name for it. But the first one I would say on this is you want to document the risks and assumptions.
Yeah.
Um, and so I kind of implied that earlier on, right? But really, you much like you document the plan, document the reasons behind the plan.
Yeah.
So as I said, you can come back to them the month after, because a big part of what you should be doing in S&OP is saying, what did we think was going to happen? What
Yeah.
happened? And then this is the why did we think that was going to happen? That's behind that. So at least you've got that. The second piece of that is assign them to a specific part of the plan. So if I flip to the 5-section sheet for a second, and just bear with
Okay.
me while I find my keyboard.
Sure.
Um, so if I look at the 5-section sheet for those that are maybe watching this for the first time, really I have the 5 sections up on my screen here, right? So when I think
Mhm.
about the parts of the plan, I've got my bookings, which are my order intake. I've got my shipments, which is my product outflow going out to the customers, right? I've got my backlog, which my backlog is the difference between my bookings and my shipments, right? If I book it, but I don't ship it, it would add to my backlog. Part of that plan, right?
Mhm.
And then I've got my production, which includes both my capability as well as my production. So that's my supply,
Yeah.
and that is my build plan. And then I really have my inventory plan, which is where am I expecting my inventory to end up? And this is both a calculation and has a target to it. And so when you're looking at that and I'm saying assign it to a specific part of the plan, I'm really saying, is it a bookings issue, which we can assign that assumption to whether we think it's going to be a bookings piece, which in this case, in almost all the cases, will be sales, right?
Yep.
Is it a production issue, which then would fall to either production or supply chain, right? And so you want to be very specific about that, right, on where those assumptions are.
So
So
one or more of the sections within the 5-section sheet is where it's gonna fall,
right,
right?
right.
Yeah.
That's the first part about that. But if I flip back to it for a second, the other thing is not just the part of the plan, but be as specific as possible about timing,
Okay.
right? And the reason I say that, if I flip back here, and we typically in the 5-section sheet will identify your frozen zone as well as potentially your firm or your cumulative supply chain lead time zone.
Right.
So knowing the timing of that and where did I, what did I assume was going to happen and where did I think it was going to happen in this horizon, right? So if I'm continually going out 12 months rolling, I do want to document where do we think that this assumption that we're making, where does it impact us? Is
Right.
it in the next 3 months? Is it 3 months, 6 months out? Is it 12 months? Something like that. So that's another one that's pretty important. And then if I flip back for a second, after the timing, you want to be as specific as possible about the quantity, right? And this sometimes is hard, but it's often in these assumptions that I might have that upside and downside number where I say, I think it could be this or it could be this. I'm thinking about it in this time horizon, but I'm essentially saying, but I think what's going to happen is this, which is actually my next point is, are we going to include that assumption in the plan or not? Right. So we might have an assumption about a new product release and new customers that are coming up as part of that, but we might not want to include it in the plan. Right. Depends how bullish we are on that.
Yeah.
And this one is specifically important when we start thinking about new product introduction. So we want to be able to say, hey, we've got an assumption, whether it's about cannibalization of the current product or whatever. We want to make sure we include that assumption and say, well, whether or not we put it into the plan. Because we could have an assumption and say, you know what, that's just too crazy. We're not going to put any of that in the plan, but at least have it documented.
So the idea behind that would be eventually it probably would work its way into the plan as it becomes a little more realistic or maybe a little clearer as to what the actual assumption should be. Is that
Yes. Yep.
if it
Yeah. If you
starts out
think
not
about
as
it,
well?
yeah, and often that'll happen, right? I'll call it the heads up, right? First month,
Right.
it's like a hey, heads up, we got this happening with this new customer coming online. We're not going to put this in the plan yet,
Yeah.
right? But then the next month, at least I've got it, right? So
Yeah.
as opposed to the next month, you come, I'm going to, hey, didn't we talk about that new customer last month? Yeah, we did. I don't know what we decided, right? And so, you're trying to get away from those water cooler conversations to actually
Right.
bring it into a bit more of a formalized process.
Yeah.
And so what does that look like if I take you through? This was the 5-section sheet that we're looking at. And so if I did a shipment drill down, for example, on this particular one, I would see all of the demand streams that go into that shipment plan that's there. And in this case, we've got these large customers, we have all other customers, and we actually have a plan, a shipment plan that goes out that includes a backlog number, and then it's got their shipment plan going out.
Mhm.
Now, what does that look like for risks and assumptions? So I specifically am looking at this period because I'm going to show you the risks and assumption sheet
Okay.
for this particular customer. Let me just make this a little bit smaller so you can
And
see
while you're
it.
doing that, let me just notify or update folks who have been hearing us talk about the 5 section sheet, both in this video and others. The 5 section sheet is a conceptual idea of how an S&OP family should be presented in the executive S&OP meeting, but also in the other meetings. And that's those 5 sections showed. The 5 section sheet looks like Excel in terms of what we've been showing you, because the DBM S&OP tool actually uses Excel as the presentation layer, but all the data is in a cloud database. So that's kind of what, when you see us flipping around back and forth and loading demand streams, that is the actual DBM S&OP tool, which Doug is currently using. But you can implement the 5 section sheet from scratch in Excel. It's a conceptual idea, or you can implement it using the DBM S&OP tool, which already obviously generates a 5 sections from the data that gets brought in from your ERP system and places like that.
It's always good. I always forget as we go through these. I always think everybody's on the same journey with us as we go along, and it's not
Our clients
necessarily.
are, but some
Yes,
people might
exactly.
be watching, just heard that term for the first
Yeah,
time. So,
exactly. So now what I'm showing you now is actually just a spreadsheet, and it's just kind of the format that we typically start out with people, and we've got some people that have continued to use this. And essentially, it hits really those first 5 points that I talked about
yeah,
of the best practices, right? So first of all, it's saying now these ones you'll notice that we haven't put a risk in here, but we've documented an assumption. And so for the example that I showed you, these guys supply into other manufacturers. And so demand is derived from what the build rate at those other manufacturers is, right?
right.
And so when I'm looking at that,
OEMs
I
or whatever.
yeah, the OEMs, right? So when I'm doing that, I basically they've gone through and documented this, that they can revisit each week. That the assumption is, hey, we have to supply 1,450 units a week to this one large customer, and then this is what we know about what their plan is and where they're going to have time off, right? And
Yeah,
so that is what's informing the decision as we go through, and that's basically what they've done in these assumptions. So next month, what it really does is it helps the demand planning process a heck of a lot,
yeah,
because you've actually documented a bunch of the things that you want to revisit each month. And like I said, you sometimes forget what they were. This way
yeah,
they're there. And essentially we start with this as the starting point for the next month. And one of the things you'll see on here is we've got the idea of timing. Now they've documented here. We provided a spot where you can say, hey, a low or high impact, a description of that. What is the timing of it? And then the following month, you can document, well, what is the result or outcome? So if it was
yeah.
something that was impacting in the first month, I'd probably want to do some documentation when I come back to say, hey, did that actually work or not? Or is that what happened? And
So
when
would that occur, for example, in what you were just showing us at the demand meeting, the first of all the meetings? Okay, so in the
yes,
demand
yes,
meeting, you're going to validate, hey, was this still a reasonable assumption, and
yes.
I move on from there. Okay,
No, and that's a really good point, because if we think about it at the exec meeting, and I know I did the drill down to the demand streams, but a lot of your families, you might only look at the 5 section sheet and say, do I have a good plan, right? And how do I, how do is it a good plan, and do we feel pretty confident about it? What's the risk level in the plan? That might be all that you really talk about.
yeah.
This documentation would happen at the demand meeting. So we typically review these in the demand meeting, but then we also review the ones on the supply side in the supply meeting, and really answer that question when we're going through there.
So you're all
And
ready by the time you get the executive meeting to speak to
uh,
the what
right,
manifested out of the risks and assumptions. Great.
right, exactly. And starting out, when you're just starting and you're on your first couple families, we include these 100% of the time in the exec presentation.
Yeah.
But then what typically people will do is they'll start to pull them out of the exec presentation, might be in the backup deck that goes to the executive. So when they're looking at it and they're reading that 5-section sheet, which I strongly recommend that you teach them how to do,
Yeah.
as they go through that, and if they've got a question, this is almost the first place I go, oh, what was the assumption around
Yeah.
that plan? I now actually have it, right? So it forces us to be pretty succinct and really procedural, if you will, about how we put those plans together.
So they're looking at the executive is looking at why demand dropped off unexpectedly, figures out that the assumption of 1450 a week that Allison thought, the big OEM was going to bring through, it did not happen. And now that conversation collapses, probably with the VP of sales and with Allison to figure out what happened.
Yep.
That's the idea, right?
Yep. That's
And maybe it's a
absolutely it.
concern, and maybe it's like, no, we'll see that next month, and it's just a blip. And so that's the idea, I think, right?
Yep.
Just nice
Yep.
closed the loop thinking and discussions, almost like the equivalent when we talk about of hidden factory and lean, like everything's kind of on the table, easy to find, discuss, at least all the chunks, and that's what's here. So scroll down to the if you don't mind, there's some
Oh,
risks on
sure.
here too.
I think on this one, I think we have one risk on this particular plan. Um,
Okay.
so they had one here for this one large customer. Business may be shutting down. No official notice. One plant closed. Right. So they went through that, and so that was one. And then yeah, you can see the other ones that were here.
So
So
that
we yeah
obviously included in the plan in some way. I can see the yes over on the right hand side for that
yes
column,
yep
because that's a big deal, right? You probably want to. But you got to make a bet. Back to what we said, you got to bet: are they going to shut the plant down this month or next month? I'm guessing that's
right
what it was. Is
yep
it going to be in
yep.
July or is it going to be in August, or is it? I guess it could be. Are they going to do it at all?
Yeah, so this was one of those things that so in the plan they have the shutdown, but they also this was a broader question. It might not be articulated as well in here, but it was completely shutting that business down. So it was
Yeah,
trying to figure out what they're going to do with that one. So yeah, it's you kind of find the way you find a way that actually starts to documenting that's meaningful for you as you go through, but it does create some a nice succinct way to do that.
yeah.
So I'm an advocate of kind of keeping a simple format to do this to
There's an
start with.
anecdote. It might need to be on here. Is another way to think about it, right?
Yes, exactly. It might need to be on here. So we kind of hit a couple of the other ones that are on my best practice. So I really, hopefully, you saw kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah,
As that. We also really saw that number 6, revisit them in the following month, right? So that's just that idea of the learning organization revisiting those assumptions and saying, hey, well, what actually did happen, and using that as a learning piece. And then really my second last one is you really want to include that in your executive presentation. You may end up dropping it out of the standard deck after a while, but you should
yeah,
have it there because I'm an advocate again of the executive gets the presentation before they're in the meeting. So they actually have a chance to go through the impact phase of seeing it and not sitting there. I mean, there's nothing worse than you're the executive that leads the business and you have the data presented to you in the meeting. You're absorbing the data, you're absorbing the story, and you may not be in the position to answer the question or ask the question.
yeah,
And by putting it in the presentation and having it earlier, you're actually giving them a chance to review it and be more engaged in the process. And so that is an important piece of that, and that's why I think including them there because it just provides almost the color commentary, like you're
yeah.
watching a sporting event. It's providing the color commentary to what's going on.
Yeah, we talk about how the executive is participating in setting the flow rate. That isn't to say that you can't set the rate without the executive. The executive decides the flow rate. Obviously, you get the executive meeting, you've got these assumptions and risks that have led to a recommended plan for the shipment plan, right? What's going to happen in sales and or in demand and supply to produce the shipment plan that we're looking at. What we're saying is we want the executive to authorize the plan. And it's
Yep.
not a report out; it's an authorization. Like you're showing me the plan because I might want to change it. I mean, at the end of the day, I own the whole thing, right? As the
Yep.
executive, and I think that's a great way to kind of talk about the risks and assumptions too. Like it's hard to authorize something that you don't even know where the numbers came from, right?
Right. Right. And you just don't want to, and that's why, having it in the presentation, having the executive have that presentation ahead of time, you're actually going to improve their engagement because you're not going to put them into an uncomfortable situation where you're
Yeah,
asking for an authorization and they're like, I don't have all the information. That's
yeah,
frustrating for the executive and it's
yeah,
frustrating for the team,
yeah. Big
right?
swing one way or the other, and suddenly you're asking for a variation on how much inventory you're going to keep for a while versus a financial plan or something like that. I mean, you got to have that stuff nailed
Yeah,
down.
it was interesting. I was in a pre-exec meeting this morning, and I was also in an executive meeting for another company, and there was one of those things that was sprung on the executive in the meeting, and he pushed back and said, like, wait a second, where's this coming from? And not having the not necessarily tied to the assumption side of it, but tied to the fact that they hadn't had the presentation ahead of time, so that makes
Yeah,
it challenging for them when you're asked something related to whether it's a capital or whether it's a headcount issue.
yeah,
Hard to react to that. my
yeah.
my last point on best practice, and you could kind of see it, I don't care if you use my format or not, that's not critical to me,
Sure.
but I, I am an advocate of utilizing a standard format. When you think of family by family going through the presentation that you do, is utilize standard formats across there. There's nothing worse than having to translate a presentation or a story that's told
Yeah.
in a certain way. And then you get to the next family and that story is told in another way with different formats, different charts, all of that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. It's almost like at the very least, it's like listening to somebody with a different dialect, right? Hey, that
Right.
guy, he must be from Minnesota. He speaks a little bit
Yeah.
differently than I do, right? But yeah, hopefully you can understand him. But it's all, it's almost like listening to someone in another language. Or somebody where, if English is your first language, it's like listening to somebody where it's a second, and you really got to concentrate. And so I'm an advocate of using that standard format as you
Yeah.
go through, because it really makes that work for this.
And we would
So
argue the most important standard format the one that really ought to be there for every family is the 5-section sheet.
right,
Conceptual or using our tool, the 5-section sheet is the way the executive and the rest of the team should be visualizing. And we showed you the numbers. We have a graphical version, but that is the right way to see your plans are for the family. And then, the next thing would be some sort of standard way of seeing the assumptions and
yep,
risk for that family.
yep,
Yeah.
yep, and I think it is an important part. I mean, we've
Yeah.
talked to, I think you can go back to the other live streams. We did talk about the 5-section sheet, and how we do that. But yeah, that to me is, um, having done this for a lot of years and walked into a lot of
Yeah.
executive presentations. I get frustrated when I can't see the entire picture for a piece of the business.
Yeah.
And that's some of the stuff we want to talk about really in our next
Right.
I think our next series, right? So maybe that's a good segue for you, Marshall,
Yeah.
to talk about that
Well, I
further.
mean, a whole possibility is how do you get the executive involved in S&OP? I think the right answer is they almost have to dive into it and drive it if it's going to run exactly the right way. But there might be some suboptimal ways to get executive involved that start moving you towards the aspirational, you know, perfect level of activity involving the executive. But certainly having stuff like this is going to make it a more compelling story and a much better chunk of information to sign off on as an executive. So,
Yeah, yeah, and and
Doug,
and the reality is that we're dealing with going back to what I talked about at the beginning. We're dealing with uncertainty as we go forward, right?
yeah,
And but we have to make an assumption, especially within our inelastic part of our plan, where it's very hard for us to react to significant upside or downside. We have to make an assumption of what we think is going to happen, and then execute towards that assumption.
Yeah.
And really, the big thing is we sure as heck want to be making the same assumption, right? Like, you
Right.
know, the last thing you want to do is have some people assuming one thing and wait a second, that's what I thought we'd agreed on. Um, that's maybe not the best way to run the business.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think all of this stuff that we show is incremental, right? You can do it just for one family to get started. You don't have to
Yep.
not do it because it seems so onerous for everything. Just start doing it for one family. Implement the 5 section sheet. Implement assumptions and risks, and you got to get your executive in the meeting for all the families. That's not how that works, but do the things that are the right things, and then they'll become more logically connected to why you should be doing them from all the families once people see them for one
Yep.
family, which is kind of our method as well. So, all right, well, good
Yeah.
stuff, Doug. Risks and
Yeah. And
assumptions. Oh,
yes,
sorry.
if someone's interested and they want that format, they can either reach out to you or myself, and I have
Sure.
no problem sharing. I mean, it's that format of the risks and assumptions, just a straight Excel sheet. It's got a little bit of
Yeah.
instruction to the front end. But if someone's interested and wants to reach out via email to one of the two of us, yeah, feel free. I have no problems providing that. I think it's important enough that you at least have some starting point, and then you can modify it and make it however you want it to look.
So I'm not sure what your email address they should use is for BEZA. It'd be info@bezaperformance.com, BEZA performance.com, info@bezaperformance.com will get you that tool that Doug showed. And then DBM Systems should have a contact page if they want to go that route,
Yep.
dbmsys.com.
Yep. And
So,
I think it'll go to admin@dbmsys.com. That's probably,
okay,
that'll be the best. Yep.
cool. Well, in 2 weeks, we'll kick off a new series. I think it's going to be pretty exciting. Um, and I just forgot what it is. It's so exciting, I forgot. I should script these more often, but Doug, remind me what it is because we talked at length
Well,
about it.
actually, it's picking up a little bit on the best practice idea, right? So it's
That's right. Thank you.
looking at
Yeah.
the different areas of best practice for S&OP.
It's so important. It's what does good like that. I'm sorry. What
That's
does good
right.
look like? Yeah. So
Yes.
for each category of S&OP, what does good look like? And that'll help kind of give you a true north for each section. So, all right, we'll start that on the 28th and look forward to seeing everybody back then. Thanks, Doug.
All right.
See you.
Bye now.